Dominic Hayes, a quiet 52-year-old truck driver and former Navy SEAL team commander, stops at a Texas diner where arrogant, undefeated MMA champion Damien Cole deliberately bullies him after spilling coffee on his table. Dominic calmly walks away, but Damien follows him outside and attacks only to be effortlessly subdued through Dominic's superior military combat skills. Humiliated, Damien tracks Dominic to a remote steel yard with two friends intending to ambush him with weapons. Dominic disables the attackers in seconds while acting purely in self-defense until police arrive. Captain Miller recognizes Dominic as a decorated former SEAL commander, and dashcam footage proves Damien orchestrated the armed assault leading to his arrest and the collapse of his fighting career. Months later, after legal consequences, public disgrace, and a permanently damaged hand, Damien seeks Dominic out to apologize and thank him for showing restraint that likely saved his life. Dominic explains that true martial arts exist to protect others, not intimidate them, and that real strength lies in having the power to destroy, but choosing peace instead, inspired by the lesson. Damien sells his MMA gym and starts a youth program dedicated to teaching discipline, humility, and respect, finally rebuilding his life on integrity rather than ego. The loudest guy in the room is rarely the most dangerous. When an undefeated MMA fighter decided to boost his ego by bullying a quiet gray-haired trucker at a Texas diner, he expected a quick submission. He had no idea he just cornered a former Navy SEAL team commander. The rain was coming down in sheets across Interstate 20, turning the neon sign of O'Malley's Diner into a blurry, bleeding smear of red and blue against the West Texas night. Inside the diner smelled of stale coffee, diesel fumes, and burnt hash browns. It was 11:45 p.m., on a Tuesday, the kind of hour that usually belonged exclusively to long-haul truckers, insomniacs, and the weary shift workers of the oil fields. Sitting in a corner booth facing the door out of a decades-old habit he couldn't break was Dominic Hayes. At 52, Dominic looked like a man who had worked hard all his life. He wore a faded flannel shirt over a thermal Henley denim jeans and scuffed work boots. His hair was salt and pepper, kept relatively short, and his face was lined with the deep crevices of a man who had spent too much time squinting into the sun. On the table next to his half-empty mug of black coffee rested a worn paperback thriller and a set of keys to a Peterbilt 389 parked idling in the massive lot outside. To anyone walking in, Dominic was just another invisible gear in the massive machine of American logistics, but Dominic wasn't just a truck driver. Underneath the flannel, his shoulders held the dense, coiled musculature of a man who had spent 2 decades carrying impossible weights through the worst environments on Earth. Before he bought his big rig to enjoy the quiet solitude of the open highway, Dominic Hayes was Commander Hayes, leading one of the most elite direct action units within the United States Navy SEALs. He had seen combat in Fallujah, the Korengal Valley, and a dozen other nameless places. He had retired quietly, trading the deafening roar of Black Hawk helicopters for the steady rumble of a diesel engine. He just wanted to be left alone. The bell above the diner door jingled violently, shattering the quiet hum of the restaurant. In walked Damien Cole. Damien was 28 years old, stood 6'2", and possessed the intimidating, heavily tattooed physique of an athlete in his prime. He was a local celebrity in Odessa, an undefeated professional mixed martial artist with a 15-0 record, heavily marketed by his management, and a newly minted black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Damien owned Ironclad Striking and Grappling, the premier MMA gym in the county. He was arrogant, loud, and constantly surrounded by a sycophantic entourage that fed his towering ego. Tonight, Damien was flanked by 2 of his heavy-hitting training partners, Leon and Brad. They strolled into the diner like they owned the lease, laughing raucously, their voices echoing off the linoleum floors. They had just finished a brutal sparring session and were riding the adrenaline high, looking for food and subconsciously an audience. The "I told him" man. Damien barked, slapping the counter hard enough to make the salt shakers jump. "I told him if he shoots for that single leg again, I'm snapping his neck. Guy has 0 head movement." Sarah, the 60-year-old waitress who had been working at O'Malley's since the Reagan administration, approached them with a tired sigh. "What can I get you, boys?" Damien didn't even look at her. 3 steaks, rare eggs, and whatever protein shakes you got in the back." He tossed his heavy, sweat-soaked gym bag carelessly onto the counter. The bag slid across the slick formica, catching the edge of Dominic's coffee mug on the adjacent corner of the booth. The heavy porcelain tipped, sending a wave of scalding dark roast cascading directly over Dominic's paperback and pooling against his forearm. The diner fell dead silent. The only sound was the hissing of the grill in the back. Dominic didn't jump. He didn't curse. He slowly pulled his arm back, picked up his soaked paperback, and shook the liquid off the pages. He grabbed a handful of paper napkins from the dispenser and began to methodically dab at the table. Leon nudged Damien, pointing at the spill and snickering. Damien finally looked over. Instead of apologizing, a smug grin spread across his face. He thrived on intimidation. It was his currency. He loved watching regular civilians shrink in his presence. "Oops, my bad, old man. Next time, don't sit so close to the splash zone." Dominic didn't look up from his wiping. "It's fine. Just watch where you throw your gear." His voice was low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of emotion. The lack of fear in Dominic's voice triggered something ugly in Damien. In the cage and in this town, people deferred to him. They recognized the cauliflower ear, the broad shoulders, the aura of violence. This gray-haired nobody in a flannel shirt wasn't giving him the respect his ego demanded. Damien took a step toward Dominic's booth, leaning his heavy frame over the table, invading Dominic's personal space. "Excuse me, did you just tell me to watch what I'm doing?" Sarah stepped in nervously. "Damien, please. He didn't mean anything. Let me just get your food." "Shut up, Sarah." Damien snapped, not breaking his stare from Dominic. "I'm talking to the trucker. You got a problem, buddy. You want me to buy you a new little book?" Dominic finished wiping the table. He neatly folded the soaked napkins, placed them on his plate, and finally raised his eyes. They were a pale, icy blue. When Damien looked into them, he expected to see anxiety, avoidance, or anger. Instead, he saw absolutely nothing. It was the detached, analytical stare of a man calculating the exact distance between a throat and a thumb. "I don't have a problem," Dominic said calmly. "I'm going to pay my bill and I'm going to leave. I suggest you go back to your friends and eat your steak." Dominic slid out of the booth, dropping a $20 bill on the table, more than enough to cover the coffee and leave a heavy tip for Sarah. He picked up his ruined book, adjusted his trucker cap, and began to walk toward the door. "Hey, I didn't say you were dismissed," Damien shouted, his face flushing red. Dominic didn't even break his stride. He pushed open the glass door and stepped out into the pouring rain, leaving Damien standing in the diner looking like a fool in front of his crew. "Let it go, D," Brad muttered. "He's just an old trucker." "No," Damien growled, his pride stung beyond repair. "Nobody turns their back on me. Nobody." He shoved past Sarah, throwing the diner door open, and marched out into the storm. The parking lot of O'Malley's was a massive expanse of cracked asphalt, deeply rutted by the weight of 18-wheelers. The rain was torrential now, turning the potholes into deep, muddy puddles. The yellow glow of the sodium streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the rows of parked freight trucks. Dominic was halfway to his Peterbilt, his boots splashing rhythmically in the puddles, his mind already shifting to the route ahead. He had a load of steel pipes to deliver to Lubbock by morning. He wasn't thinking about the arrogant kid in the diner. To Dominic, Damien was a non-factor, a minor environmental hazard like a blown tire or a patch of black ice. "Hey, Flannel." Dominic stopped. He let out a slow, controlled breath, the kind he used to exhale right before pulling the trigger of a MK-11 sniper rifle. He didn't want to do this. He was a man of peace now. He had spent his youth swimming in violence, and he had no desire to drown in it again over a filled cup of coffee. He turned around slowly. Damien was marching through the rain, his broad shoulders hunched aggressively, fists clenched. Leon and Brad had followed him out and were standing under the diner's awning, watching with grim anticipation. "You think you can just walk away when I'm talking to you?" Damien snarled, closing the distance until he was less than 3 feet from Dominic. The rain plastered Damien's tight shirt to his muscular chest. Son Dominic said, his voice cutting clearly through the sound of the storm. "You are looking for a fight to prove something to yourself. I am not the man you want to test that on. Turn around, go inside, enjoy your youth." It was a sincere warning, but to Damien's ears it sounded like patronizing disrespect. "I'm going to put you to sleep, old man," Damien sneered. Damien moved with the lightning speed of a professional athlete. He threw a devastating left hook, a punch that had knocked out 3 men in his last 5 fights. It was technically perfect, loaded with torque from his hips, aimed squarely at Dominic's jaw, but Dominic wasn't there. To an MMA fighter, a fight is a sport with rules, a referee, a mat, and a bell. To a Tier 1 operator, a physical altercation is a life-or-death crisis to be neutralized in milliseconds using the path of least resistance. As Damien's shoulder twitched, Dominic's military OODA loop observe, orient, decide, act, process the threat faster than conscious thought. Before Damien's fist crossed the halfway point, Dominic stepped inside the punch, completely bypassing the strike zone. Dominic's left hand shot up not to block, but to parry the bicep, redirecting Damien's momentum forward. Simultaneously, Dominic dropped his weight and brought his right boot sharply into the side of Damien's lead knee. Not a hard, bone-breaking kick, but a perfectly timed structural disruption, deprived of his base and fighting his own forward momentum. Damien lost his footing on the slick, oil-stained asphalt. He went down hard, face first, into a puddle of muddy rainwater, scraping his chin on the gravel. Under the awning, Leon and Brad gasped. The undefeated champion had just been dumped on his face by a guy who looked like a hardware store manager. Damien scrambled to his feet, spitting mud, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and uncontrollable rage. "You lucky old bastard!" he screamed. Abandoning his striking, Damien reverted to his bread and butter, his grappling. He lunged forward for a double-leg takedown, intending to drive Dominic into the concrete, mount him, and rain down elbows. Dominic saw the level change instantly. He didn't try to sprawl like a wrestler. Instead, as Damien lunged, Dominic pivoted sharply on his heel, stepping off the center line like a matador. As Damien flew past, grabbing empty air, Dominic brought his right forearm crashing down onto the back of Damien's neck with the weight of a falling anvil. Damien collapsed onto the asphalt again, the breath violently knocked out of his lungs. Before Damien could react, Dominic dropped his knee directly into the center of Damien's spine, pinning him to the ground. In a fraction of a second, Dominic seized Damien's right wrist, twisted it violently behind his back, and applied a joint lock that immediately stressed the shoulder to the very edge of dislocation. Damien let out a choked gasp of excruciating pain. The rain beat down on his back. He couldn't move an inch. The pressure on his shoulder was agonizing, precise, and completely inescapable. Dominic leaned down, his face inches from Damien's ear. The trucker wasn't breathing heavily. His heart rate hadn't even spiked. "Listen to me very carefully," Dominic whispered, his voice as cold as the rain. "In the ring, the referee stops the fight when you tap. Out here, there is no referee. If you try to stand up before I reach my truck, I will shatter your rotator cuff and you will never throw another punch for the rest of your life." Do you understand? Damien, trembling from the pain and the terrifying realization of his own utter helplessness, squeezed his eyes shut and nodded. Yeah, I understand." Dominic held the lock for 2 more seconds, ensuring the psychological dominance was complete, then smoothly released the wrist and stood up. He didn't look back at Leon or Brad. He walked to his Peterbilt, climbed into the cab, fired up the massive engine, and pulled out onto Interstate 20, the roar of his exhaust drowning out the storm. Damien lay in the mud for a long time, clutching his shoulder, staring at the red tail lights disappearing into the dark. He had just been physically and psychologically dismantled in less than 10 seconds. The undefeated black belt had finally met a master, and it broke his mind. For Damien Cole, the humiliation in the diner parking lot was a cancer that began to eat him alive from the inside out. The next 3 days were a living nightmare. His shoulder throbbed, a constant physical reminder of his inadequacy. But the mental anguish was far worse. Leon and Brad hadn't told anyone at the gym what had happened. Damien had threatened to ruin their lives if they breathed a word of it, but Damien could feel the shift in their eyes. The reverence was gone, replaced by a lingering, uncomfortable doubt. Damien couldn't train. Every time he hit the heavy bag, he saw the icy, empty blue eyes of the truck driver. He saw the way the older man had moved. No wasted energy, no telegraphing, just brutal, geometric efficiency. It wasn't MMA. It was something entirely different, something Damien didn't understand, and that terrified him. To reclaim his sanity and his alpha status, Damien convinced himself it was a fluke. The rain, the slick asphalt, a lucky trip. He needed to prove it. He needed to find the trucker, corner him, and beat him into the dirt where there were no slippery puddles and no chance for a lucky escape. Damien's older brother, Greg, worked as a dispatcher for a regional freight logistics company based out of Midland. It took Damien exactly 24 hours of leaning on his brother and calling in favors to run the plates of the Peterbilt, which Leon had managed to memorize and track down the driver's manifest. "His name is Dominic Hayes," Greg told Damien over the phone, sounding uneasy. "He's an independent owner-operator. He's got a drop-off scheduled at a steel yard in Lubbock late Thursday night. Why do you need this, D? Don't worry about it. Damien hung up. By midnight on Thursday, Damien, Leon, and Brad were sitting in Damien's lifted black Ford Raptor parked with its lights off in the shadows of the deserted industrial sector of Lubbock. The steel yard was a massive fenced-in compound surrounded by abandoned warehouses and empty lots. There were no streetlights here, no cameras, no witnesses. I don't know about this man, Brad said from the back seat, staring nervously at the imposing gates of the steel yard. That guy there was something wrong with him. He didn't fight like a civilian. He's a nobody. Damien snapped his knuckles, turning white on the steering wheel. He got lucky. Tonight we show him what happens when he steps into my world. He doesn't leave this lot walking. At 1:15 a.m., the deep guttural rumble of a diesel engine broke the silence. The bright LED headlights of Dominic's Peterbilt swept across the cracked pavement as the massive rig made a wide turn toward the steel yard's loading gates. Damien threw the Raptor into gear. He slammed the gas pedal, the truck roaring to life, and shot out of the shadows. He positioned the Raptor directly in front of the locked steel yard gates, aggressively cutting off the Peterbilt and forcing Dominic to slam on his air brakes. The massive semi hissed to a halt, nose to nose with the pickup. Damien kicked his door open and stepped out into the cold night air. Leon and Brad followed, grabbing heavy aluminum flashlights from the center console. Inside the cab of his truck, Dominic Hayes sat perfectly still. He looked down at the three men illuminated by his headlights. He recognized the arrogant kid from the diner, his arms still moving a little stiffly. Dominic let out a long, heavy sigh. He reached over and turned off the engine. When Dominic stepped down from the cab, the atmosphere in the loading dock shifted. This wasn't a rainy diner parking lot. This was a dark, isolated arena. Dominic's demeanor had completely changed. In Odessa, he had been a man trying to avoid a conflict. Tonight, assessing the vehicle blocked the numbers and the weapons in their hands. Commander Hayes realized avoidance was no longer a tactical option. These men had hunted him. They intended to do severe bodily harm. The civilian switch in Dominic's brain clicked to the off position. The operator awoke. 3-on-1. Damien yelled, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls of the warehouses. Nowhere to run, old man. No slick puddles to hide behind. You humiliated me. Now I'm going to break your jaw. Dominic didn't speak. He walked slowly toward the front of his rig, stopping directly in the glare of his own headlights. He lowered his center of gravity slightly. His hands rested loosely at his sides. Brad was the first to make a mistake. Eager to impress Damien, he lunged forward, swinging the heavy aluminum flashlight at Dominic's head like a baseball bat. In professional fighting, you block and counter. In warfare, you eliminate the threat. Dominic burst forward with a speed that defied his age. He didn't back away from the swinging weapon. He stepped directly into the attack. He jammed his left forearm into Brad's bicep, stopping the swing dead in its tracks, while simultaneously driving the heel of his right hand upward in a devastating palm strike directly under Brad's chin. The impact sounded like a cracking branch. The concussive force snapped Brad's head back violently, rattling his brainstem. Brad's eyes rolled back into his head, and he crumpled to the concrete like a puppet with its strings cut, entirely unconscious before he hit the ground. The flashlight clattered uselessly away. Total elapsed time 2 seconds. Leon froze his flashlight, trembling in his hand. The swagger drained from his body instantly. He looked at Brad out cold and then at Dominic, who hadn't even broken a sweat. Leon took 2 steps backward, dropping his weapon. I'm out, man. I don't want this. Coward Damien screamed, his rage blinding him to the reality of what he had just witnessed. Damien charged. He abandoned his technique, throwing a wild, ferocious overhand right fueled by pure adrenaline and hatred. Dominic didn't dodge. He executed a brutal, close-quarters defense taught exclusively to elite military operators. He stepped slightly offline and aggressively drove his lead elbow directly into the path of Damien's incoming fist. Damien's knuckles smashed into the solid bone of Dominic's elbow. A sickening crack echoed through the lot. Damien shrieked in agony as 2 metacarpal bones in his right hand shattered upon impact. But Dominic didn't stop. He was actively neutralizing the threat. As Damien recoiled, cradling his broken hand, Dominic grabbed the back of Damien's thick neck with his left hand, pulling him downward. Dominic drove his right knee upward with piston-like force, burying it deep into Damien's solar plexus. All the air evacuated Damien's lungs in a violent rush. He gagged his eyes, bulging his legs, turning to jelly. Dominic maintained his grip on Damien's neck, forcing the larger, younger man down onto his knees. Dominic stood over him, his breathing steady, his face an emotionless mask of cold, hard steel. "You hunted a man you didn't know," Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with a terrifying absolute authority. "You cornered me in the dark. That was a tactical error." Before Damien could process the pain or the terror, the piercing wail of sirens shattered the night. Red and blue strobe lights painted the brick walls of the alleyway as 3 Lubbock Police Department cruisers came screeching around the corner, boxing in the Raptor and the Peterbilt. Tires smoked as the officers jumped out, weapons drawn, hands in the air. "Everybody freeze," a voice commanded over a PA system. Damien, gasping for air on his knees, felt a sudden surge of twisted relief. The police were here. He was the victim now. Look at his broken hand. Look at Brad on the ground. This crazy trucker was going to go to jail for assault. Damien would ruin him in civil court. Officer Damien wheezed, pointing a trembling, uninjured finger at Dominic. "Arrest him. He attacked us. He nearly killed my friend." An older officer with a captain's bars on his collar stepped forward through the glare of the headlights. His service weapon pointed toward the ground. Captain Miller had been on the force for 30 years. He approached the scene, his eyes moving from the unconscious Brad to the kneeling, broken Damien, and finally to the gray-haired man standing calmly with his hands raised in the air. Captain Miller stopped dead in his tracks. He lowered his weapon completely. A look of profound shock followed by deep respect washed over his face. "Stand down," Captain Miller ordered his officers, gesturing for them to lower their guns. Damien looked at the captain, confused and frantic. "What are you doing? Arrest him." Captain Miller ignored the bleeding MMA fighter on the ground. He walked straight up to the trucker, snapped to attention, and offered a crisp, unmistakable military salute. "Commander Hayes," Captain Miller said, his voice thick with reverence. "It's been a long time, sir. Are you injured?" Damien's heart stopped. The world around him seemed to lose all its sound. He stared at the captain, then slowly looked up at the trucker in the flannel shirt. "Commander." The pieces began to fall into place, crushing the undefeated black belt beneath the staggering, terrifying weight of what he had just done. The heavy Texas night was fractured by the spinning strobe of police lights, painting the corrugated steel of the warehouses in rhythmic flashes of crimson and sapphire. For a moment, the only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of Damien Cole and the idling engines of the Lubbock police cruisers. Damien stared at Captain Miller, his mind struggling to process the scene. The veteran police officer, a man who had undoubtedly seen decades of gang violence, bar brawls, and felony assaults, was standing at rigid attention, saluting a trucker in a faded flannel shirt. Dominic Hayes slowly lowered his hands. The ice in his pale blue eyes thawed just a fraction, replaced by a weary recognition. He returned the salute with a crisp, fluid motion that spoke of muscle memory etched deep into his bones. "At ease, Tom," Dominic said quietly. "It's been a while since anyone called me commander. I drive a Peterbilt now." Captain Miller relaxed his posture, but the reverence in his eyes didn't fade. He stepped closer, shaking Dominic's hand firmly. "I heard you retired out of Coronado, sir, but I never expected to find you running freight in my district. Not after what your team did in Ramadi. My son was with the 3rd Battalion 4th Marines over there. Your boys pulled his squad out of a hell of a firefight in 2006. I've owed you a beer for 20 years. Your boy made it home. That's payment enough." Dominic replied, his voice softening. Damien, still on his knees in the damp gravel, felt a cold dread pooling in his stomach. His right hand was a throbbing mass of agony, the shattered bones grinding together with every pulse of his racing heart. He looked at Brad, who was just beginning to groan and stir blood trickling from a split chin. Leon was standing near the fence, his hands raised, weeping silently in sheer terror. Captain Damien gasped, desperate to regain control of the narrative. "I don't care who he is. Look at my hand. Look at my friend. He's a maniac." Captain Miller slowly turned his attention down to the MMA fighter. The warmth evaporated from the officer's face, replaced by a hardened professional scowl. He recognized Damien. Everyone in West Texas who followed local sports knew who Damien Cole was. "I know exactly who he is, Mr. Cole," Miller said, his voice dripping with contempt. "And I know who you are. You're the loudmouth from the Odessa gyms who likes to bully sparring partners, but tonight you made the worst calculation of your miserable life." Miller gestured to the two younger officers who were already moving in with handcuffs. You see, Miller continued standing over Damien. Commander Dominic Hayes spent 22 years in the United States Navy. He was a Tier 1 operator SEAL Team 6. He has a Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and a chest full of Purple Hearts. He has survived ambushes by hardened insurgents in the Korangal Valley and door-to-door warfare in Fallujah. And you brought a flashlight and 2 gym buddies to a fight with him. The words hit Damien harder than Dominic's knee had. SEAL Team 6. The undefeated black belt, the local champion, the apex predator of the regional MMA circuit, suddenly realized he was nothing more than an infant playing with a loaded gun. The sheer scale of Dominic's background eclipsed Damien's entire world. Damien had spent his life training to win rounds in a padded cage with a referee ready to jump in. Dominic had spent his life in environments where losing meant you didn't go home in a box. You just didn't go home at all. He assaulted us," Damien stammered, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Dominic finally spoke, walking slowly toward the front of his rig. He reached up and tapped a small black plastic square mounted near the top of his windshield. "High-definition dash cam, son," Dominic said, his tone devoid of anger, merely stating facts. "It's got night vision and audio. It recorded your Ford Raptor cutting me off. It recorded you and your friends exiting with weapons. It recorded you declaring your intent to commit grievous bodily harm. Under Texas law, I was well within my rights to use lethal force to defend my life against an armed 3-man ambush. You should be thanking God I decided to dismantle you instead of bury you." The remaining color drained from Damien's face. The physical pain in his shattered hand was suddenly overshadowed by the crushing weight of his impending reality. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment conspiracy. His career wasn't just paused, it was entirely annihilated. "Cuff him," Captain Miller ordered. "Read them all their rights. Get an ambulance for the one on the ground and call a tow truck for that Raptor. It's evidence now." As the officers hauled Damien to his feet, ignoring his winces of pain as they secured his left wrist to his belt, he looked over his shoulder. Dominic Hayes wasn't gloating. He wasn't celebrating a victory. The older man was simply inspecting the front bumper of his Peterbilt for damage, his mind already returning to the steel pipes he had to deliver. To Dominic, Damien wasn't a conquered enemy. He was just a delay in the schedule. And to Damien's shattered ego, that total indifference was the most devastating blow of all. 4 months later, the West Texas wind was howling across the plains, kicking up dust devils that danced along the shoulder of Route 285. Damien Cole sat in a vinyl booth at a roadside diner just outside of Pecos. He looked different. The arrogant swagger that used to radiate from his pores was completely gone. He had lost 15 lumabs of muscle. His right hand rested on the table, bearing a jagged, angry surgical scar that ran from his knuckles to his wrist, a permanent reminder of the metal plates and screws holding his metacarpals together. The criminal charges had nearly ruined him. It took his life savings, a top-tier defense attorney, and Dominic Hayes' surprising refusal to aggressively pursue the maximum penalty to keep Damien out of a state penitentiary. He had pled down to a severe misdemeanor slapped with thousands of hours of community service and 5 years of strict probation. But the public fallout had been absolute. Leon had talked. The story of the invincible Damien Cole getting put down in 2 seconds by a gray-haired trucker spread through the MMA community like wildfire. His sponsors dropped him. His gym membership plummeted. He was a laughingstock. The bell above the diner door jingled. Damien looked up. Dominic Hayes walked in. The older man looked exactly the same. Faded jeans, work boots, a plain jacket. He paused, spotting Damien in the booth. For a fraction of a second, the tactical computer in Dominic's brain assessed the environment, checking Damien's hands, his posture, and the exits, recognizing no threat. Dominic's posture softened. Damien didn't stand up to posture. He didn't sneer. He simply raised his left hand in a meek, awkward greeting. Dominic walked over and slid into the booth across from him. "You've got a lot of nerve tracking my routes, Cole. I told the dispatcher to keep my manifests private. Greg got fired for giving me your route the first time," Damien said quietly, staring into his black coffee. "I didn't hack your company. I've just been sitting at truck stops along your usual corridor for 3 weeks hoping I'd run into you." Dominic signaled the waitress for a coffee. Why, Damien took a deep, shaky breath. He looked at his scarred right hand. The doctors say I'll never have the grip strength to grapple at a professional level again. The torque required for a kimura or a rear naked choke, the bones won't hold up. My career is over. Dominic didn't offer any fake sympathy. Every action has a consequence. You rolled the dice in the dark and you lost. I know, Damien said, his voice cracking slightly. He looked up, meeting Dominic's icy blue eyes, but this time Damien didn't look away. I'm not here to complain. I'm here to say thank you. Dominic's brow furrowed slightly. Thank me for shattering your hand and ruining your life. For saving it, Damien corrected. I was out of control, Mr. Hayes. I thought because I could beat people up in a cage I was a god. I surrounded myself with yes-men. I bullied people because I was terrified of being average. If it hadn't been you in that steel yard, if it had been someone with a gun or someone who didn't have your restraint, I'd be dead. Or I would have ended up killing some poor civilian and spending life in prison. The waitress dropped off Dominic's coffee. He took a slow sip, studying the broken young man across from him. The hatred was gone from Damien's eyes, replaced by a profound, humbling emptiness that Dominic recognized. It was the look of a man who'd survived a crucible and was now desperately trying to figure out how to rebuild his soul. Martial arts, Dominic said slowly, was originally designed to protect the weak from predators, to cultivate discipline, respect, and inner peace. You bastardized it. You used it to become the predator. I know, Damien whispered. The cage is a game, Dominic continued, leaning forward. It has rounds. It has a doctor on standby. Real violence, the kind of violence that happens in the mud in the dark, where there are no rules, is ugly, sickening, and tragic. Anyone who goes looking for it is a fool. Anyone who glorifies it has never actually seen it. How do you carry it? Damien asked, genuine desperation in his voice. Knowing what you can do, knowing what you've done, how do you just drive a truck and let people spill coffee on you? Dominic looked out the window at his massive Peterbilt gleaming in the afternoon sun. Because I know exactly what I am, Dominic said softly. I don't need to prove it to a waitress or to a kid in a diner. True strength isn't the ability to destroy everything in your path. True strength is having the absolute capacity for destruction and choosing to be gentle instead. You are a black belt in jiu-jitsu, Damien. You learned the mechanics of breaking a man. Now you need to learn the discipline of building yourself. Damien absorbed the words, feeling them settle into the empty spaces of his shattered ego. He reached into his jacket with his good hand and pulled out a thick, leather-bound notebook. I sold the MMA gym, Damien said. I used the money to pay off the restitution and the legal fees, but I kept the community center lease. I'm starting a program for at-risk youth, teaching them wrestling, but mostly trying to teach them not to end up like me. I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to know that you didn't just break a bully, you stopped one. Dominic looked at the notebook, then back at Damien. For the first time since they met, a warm smile cracked the hardened lines of the former SEAL commander's face. Dominic reached across the table and extended his hand. Damien hesitated, then reached out with his scarred right hand, grasping Dominic's. The grip was weak, but the intention behind it was solid. Good luck, Damien, Dominic said. Dominic stood up, left a $5 bill on the table for his coffee, and walked out the door. Damien watched through the glass as the old trucker climbed into his rig. The massive diesel engine roared to life, a deep, rhythmic heartbeat of steel and oil. The truck pulled onto the highway, shifting gears, disappearing into the vast open horizon of the Texas plains. Damien sat in the quiet diner, nursing his cold coffee. For the first time in his entire life, he wasn't undefeated. He was broken, scarred, and humbled. And for the first time, he finally felt like a real man. If this story of humility, unchecked ego, and true strength resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. We all know someone who needs a reminder that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous. Hit that like button to show your respect for the silent professionals walking among us. Share this video with your friends to spread the message, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible, gripping stories of real-life encounters.